Also, okay. Also thinking about when I was there, I was thinking through the art of instrument making within Ngoma, the art of music making within Ngoma, and its connection to the spiritual heritage of the people. More interestingly was when I started to unpack where they were from. You know, I guess we talk about hard science, genetic studies of where the Siddhis were from. They were from the East African region, going from, I guess, what they would call Abyssinia back then, Ethiopia, coming down. Also, people saying that they're from the genetic encoding also encompasses Angola, which is on, I guess, the west, the southwest of the African continent. And just interested in the fact that, and Kenya as well, Uganda, when you're looking at the words that were being used, the words within the language still contained within it what we'd call Bantu or African dialect within that language. And so what was most noticeable for me was the fact that they were saying Ngoma, you know, they're like, okay, we're practicing Sidi Ngoma. And what was beautiful about that revelation was understanding and unpacking what Ngoma is at home. You know, what is Ngoma? We have Janssen and other thinkers explaining Ngoma as a proto-Bantu cognitive. It's a consciousness that the Bantu-speaking people had that encompassed science, you know, the concept of science, the concept of astrology, understanding the universe, the spiritual context, which right now, whenever we think of Ngoma, sometimes it's oversaturated with spiritual connotations, as in spiritual in the context of stripping Africans away from what the academy would consider more harder sciences. It's more like, oh, it's a belief system that they have that relates not so much to the natural and the physical and metaphysical world. So moving on from there, it started, moving on from there was Ngoma as a musical construct, because when you translate Ngoma in different languages within the continent, Ngoma either is a drum, you know, it's East Africa, they play, oh, what is Ngoma? Ah, it's a drum. In Southern Africa, what is Ngoma? Ingoma is a song. Ubungoma is the path of traditional healing. Isangoma, in isiZulu, particularly within that dialect, is someone who's a traditional healer. And so I started to realize that there's a larger idea of what Ngoma is that we're not tapping into when we're thinking about music and its technologies within the African continent and within its larger diaspora. What I started to find and was very interested in is how different African communities, sages and masters were using the technology of Ngoma, of music, of spirituality and medicine to relay either the integrity of the consciousness of the people, to heal the people, to share the genealogy or the historical accounts of where people were from. And so I started to become more of an advocate of a deeper understanding and a deeper listening to the consciousness of Ngoma. And that journey was led by, you know, going to different masters within their homesteads, sitting with them, learning to build instruments, asking them how to play, what are the significant informations being relayed within these musical instruments and this musical culture. And with that experience came a deeper appreciation to the connection that all Africans, whether they be in India, whether they be in Brazil, you know, under Capoeira, whether they be in North America, there's a deep relationship within the science of Ngoma. And I guess this is an introduction to a film that I want to share with you. You know, it's a documentary that I titled Sages and Bows, because the idea that African musicality does not encompass a deepest understanding of vibration, a deep understanding of the spiritual vibration, so both physical but also metaphysical vibration. I started to think, in my relationship as a researcher within the context of the University of Cape Town, it was strange that I was thinking of the musicians themselves more as people who just play. Oh, they just gather and they play, whether gather ceremoniously or alone. But I didn't really appreciate until I was deep within it that there's such a beautiful and profound relationship with music, with the universe that these sages had, and they were holding such an important piece of knowledge that connected us to ancient Africa and to the present. So the film that I'd like to show you demonstrates these masters. And what I'll do is because it's 20 minutes, I will play the video, stop it, play, stop, so that we all can have, see the length of the masters themselves, give them 2-minute segments each, have some commentary along there. What I want to, I guess, give as this was all an introduction to that, but just an introduction to the film. I really would like you to take note of the masters, what they look like, what they sound like. I intentionally did not put subtitles on what was being said, because I think that there needs to be a deeper appreciation for a musical process, a scientific process that goes beyond language of English, because what happens is the translation will inevitably be translated to English. And these are masters from India, Mozambique, from Lesotho, from KZN, speaking 5 different languages. So I said, no, let's hear them. Let's hear what they have to say to us, and let's listen to them with a deeper understanding of what vibration is. And I think that it conveys for me. So just want you to keep that in mind. Let me just screen share and work with technology here. There we go.
So you can keep the normal one. Yes, put some spice in it. It's eating this food. The first one.
Marco.
Chilla rhythm.
Am I audible even with the screen share?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to take a moment there just to reflect on these three masters, to give some context. What's profound to me within the space is that the first masters, situated in KZN, rural KZN, KwaZulu-Natal in Southern Africa. The second is Machume Zangu. Machume Zangu is situated within Maputo, in Mozambique. The third is my master here is Master Sultan. Master Sultan is based in Gujarat, in Vijapur, in India. What's beautiful about this is that if you look at the instrument itself, is that here are three different locations within, I guess, the world, each playing a centrally braced bow. Within the centrally braced bow, we see the style of playing is different perhaps, but the consciousness behind that style is very similar. A lot of people, when I play with it, they think perhaps it's all in one space or in one region. And these are just masters within a certain area. Also, if you look at their features as well, you think, oh, these are part of the same region. But no, these are three different masters who have not necessarily made, each playing a centrally braced bow that's named uniquely. Within KZN, it's called Makoyan. Within Maputo, it's called the Shidende. And within, with the Siddhis, it's called the Malunga bow. And for me, this was interesting because when I was thinking about the time in which the Africans were taken from Africa or had journeyed to India, either being enslaved or coming there as performers, or some becoming merchants, some becoming horse herders, some becoming very powerful people within that community. This is happening about 1,000 years ago. And you think to yourself, what were people moving with when they were going to perhaps India? So Africans going from Africa, what were they moving with? What ideas were they moving with? What consciousness were they moving with? Because you think, how did they retain such a detailed mechanism of how the instrument is made, the idea of how it's played, when it's played, being so similar within their context, it being so similar to the Ngoma consciousness and the Ngoma instrumentation of the centrally braced bow within KZN, as I showed you, and within in Mozambique. What's notable, for example, is how the notes themselves replicate a sound or a song or a language. The bow itself is playing a language. So for example, with the rhythm that Master Sultan is playing with Shilla, so the bow is singing literally Shilla dun dun, Shilla dun dun. And as you understand that and you listen to it, you listen to the bow singing back to the player. And I wonder, what does that do to you when the vibrations are singing back to you? With Umabengu, when we look at her play, Umabengu being the first bow master, just really, when it takes me back to that moment when I was sitting with her, she was playing. She had disappeared somewhere. I don't know where she went, but she just sat in silence and picked up her bow and she just started playing. She started playing. I don't know what was going on in her life. I don't know what she was thinking about, but I understood the energy of the silence, of the magic that was happening. And I thought to myself how deeply intimate the relationship is of the technology of the bow and the bow master, and the language of the bow, what the bow is saying to those who understand that language. And that is the other reason why I didn't want subtitles, because I wanted people to listen to what the language of the bow is saying. Does it resonate? Does it connect to your geographical location? Because here's a beautiful conversation about how geographical location, time, oppression, and other factors that have happened to all of these people. If you look at in India, it's the same. In Southern Africa, it was the same. Within Mozambique, here places of genocide, here people of oppression of African people. But the music still retains in that relationship, even if it's just one person. When you see and hear them play, that consciousness still retains. And that's, for me, replicates when we understand the power of Ngoma, when we understand it beyond its more rudimentary understanding of, oh, it's an instrument, oh, it's a song, oh, it's a people, oh, it's a language. But we understand the spiritual significance of the practice of Ngoma, the healing consciousness of Ngoma. It is very apparent within, the masters themselves. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I just wanted to stop at that point and carry on am I still good, Doctor?
I think we're running low on time, but go ahead and walk us through. Take us through about 5 more minutes of your presentation, if you can. Is that okay?
That's perfect. I think I'll end it with this out.
Haiba na himana bashanyana ba babishitse mollo me banyenze mahete bale mollo na o hlaya mane mahemi ha ntso kutlwa ne yale ne yuthike mshi yalo tayi kaona ha ke elisa mme ke ta etsa masalosetso mona me ne ke letsa tshina ke ha ile etsa tshina e etsa tshina ya ditlhaloso yo ha ke ne go tsena ga mo dumela
In the screen share with them. And the reason why I wanted to end it with Elder Ndate Mahlumule. Rest in peace to Madala Matusi. We didn't get to see him play, and rest in peace to Ndate Mahlumule as well, who was just the elder who played now. I think what's beautiful about it is that illustration is the power of the single string, within this whole, the technology of the single string. A lot of orchestras across the world, we see 10, 8, 12 strings, but within the bow consciousness of ngoma, what is so beautiful is the understanding of how to manipulate vibrations with the single string. And that is found within so many geographical locations. And what does it take to, I always think, what did the first people, what was their relationship between the music? I recall when I was doing the study, some people said that there's all these strange theories. Oh, people heard the calabash when they were filling up water, and through that they heard those sounds. Some bow within the San communities within Southern Africa, it was when they were hunting and they would shoot the bowstring, and that passing vibration and note that past the ears, what spurred them on. I don't know if any of those are true, but I always think about how powerful the connection within the single string, within medicine, within the cultural, historical integrity and the connectedness of ngoma consciousness. If you look at just where the music is going, how it's played, who's playing. And I think, yeah, rest in peace to Ndate Mahlumule as well. I think it's a beautiful place to end, just showing the power of Lisiba, which is, the instrument is called the feather, based in Lesotho.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Koala, for that. That was amazing. So we're going to reserve questions and answers for the end, in hopes that we can sort of highlight important points as well as find common threads throughout the presentations. And so next up, we will have Dr. Jasmine Graves. So we leave it to you, Dr. Graves.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carter. And thank you, Dr. Koala, Mr. Koala, for your presentation. I think the vibrations of the masters and their bows, and the vibrations of just the expertise that you shared on Ngoma consciousness definitely helped to situate our conversation and expand our awareness. So I appreciate your presentation so much. Thank you, Mr. Koala. Now I'd like to share my screen and share with you this presentation. I'm going to hide the controls so that you can see fully. So as Mr. Koala mentioned, the Siddhis of Gujarat are an African diasporan community in Western India, living in the state of Gujarat. And there they are said to have to number around 5,000 within that state. So this presentation focuses on the preservation of what Mr. Koala calls Ngoma consciousness through language, through devotional song, and through the musical instruments of the Siddhi community of Gujarat. On the first slide here, I'm showing you a picture of the sea. This is a picture of the sea as seen from the western coast of India in Gujarat. And the first point I'd like to alight upon here is that when we consider the role of the sea in the consciousness of the African diaspora in the Atlantic world, Dr. Daniel Black at Clark University in Atlanta tells us that the sea is a sacred space in the context of the Atlantic, given that it is a burial ground for those ancestors who could not complete the journey or refused to complete the journey to the Americas. On the Indian Ocean side of things, the sea is a sacred space for those Africans and their descendants in diaspora, in that the sea is a pathway for the transmission of spiritual technologies from Eastern Africa to Western India. So you'll find that seawater is used in different rituals of the Siddhis of Gujarat to purify the gathering, to purify the space. And you'll find that seawater is also used to cleanse certain instruments, sacred instruments, while these instruments are being constructed. So as you saw in Mr. Kuala's documentary, you saw the instrument to the right called the Mai Misra rattle. And it's named after Mai Misra, whose name tells us that she is mother, Mai, from Egypt, Misr, the Arabic word for Egypt being Misr. So Mai Misra is considered an ancestral saint of the Siddhi community of Gujarat. And we see a shrine of Mai Misra featured in the image to the left. And on the right, in the window of that shrine, we see the Mai Misra rattles. So there's a story that's been told in different by different people at different times relating to the Mai Misra rattle. And I'll give it to you in brief. One story tells us that this rattle, there was a family in Jamnagar in Gujarat, in the district of Gujarat where I've taken that photograph of the sea. And this family decided that for whatever reason, they no longer wanted their Mai Misra rattles. So they went to the seaside and placed these rattles in the sea. And in the image that you see here, you see the ceremonial cloth that is used to adorn the shrine of Mai Misra and the other ancestor saints, and the ceremonial cloth that is used to adorn these instruments cast into the sea. So the family placed their Mai Misra rattles in the sea and returned to their home. And when they did so, they were shocked to find the rattles back in the sacred space in their home, in their household shrine. So what this narrative is repeated in different ways. Other people attest similar stories of giving up their rattles and finding that they're back home in the same place. There are other stories that attest to the seaborne, the independent agency of these instruments as they travel to and fro, as they travel to where they would like to be ceremonially housed. There are similar stories about the drum that we see in the right, image on the right. This drum is called the Mugurman, and it's a standing footed drum that is a central part of the Siddhi Goma performance. And Abdulaziz Lodhi, who is a linguist, gives us an etymology for this term Mugurman. He calls it the Goma ya Magulumane, the Goma drum of 4 feet, the 4-footed drum. So there are stories that the Mugurman itself has crossed the sea to arrive in India and to be housed in a particular shrine. There are other stories that point to these instruments that you see before you in another shrine of these Siddhi ancestor saints in Mumbai. These instruments are called nangas, and they formerly had 7 strings. Although these instruments are so ancient now that the hide is peeling and the strings are no longer there, but they're ceremonially housed in the shrine. And a similar story as to the one that I've told at the beginning of this presentation, there's an oral history that these 4 lyres, these 4 nangas, crossed the sea and arrived at the seaside in Mumbai of their own volition, where they communicated with those African descendants in Mumbai through dreams, saying, "We are here, come and get us." So some Siddhi shrine keepers collected these instruments from the seaside and brought them to the space where you see them ceremonially housed today. And in the Persian Gulf region, we also find similar stories about these sacred lyres, which originate in present-day Sudan, traveling across the Persian Gulf of their own volition to where to escape a fire and to arrive in a new location where they would be safely housed. So all of these stories about the self-motivated, free travel of these instruments, which are indicative of ancestral traditions and which themselves are associated with ancestor saints, such as the Mayan Misra rattle and the other instruments that are used today in Siddhi Boma, speak to the free and forced migrations of people of African descent throughout the Indian Ocean world. The map that I'm showing on this slide only gives us the time frame from 1500 to 1900, but we know that Siddhis, or Indians of African ancestry, were already in India. At the time, they were called Habshis, referring to their origins in what was called Abyssinia or Ethiopia at the time. We know that there were Habshis serving in different the Delhi Sultanate, for instance, in the 13th century. And we also know that migration and trade between Ethiopia and Western India dates back to the first millennium. So there are several thousands of years of migration, trade, and exchange between the Horn of Africa and Western India that cannot be encapsulated in a simple notion of slavery or forced migration as the only motivating factor for the migrations of Africans and their descendants to India. So we know that trade was a part of this wave of migration. Some of the ancestor saints, such as Baba Gaur, the primary ancestor saint of the Siddhi community, he is understood to have been a trader of the agate bead or the carnelian stone. So trade is a part of this movement. Forced migration is not only limited to forced migration. So in brief, multiple waves of migration brought Africans and their descendants to Western India. From the earliest documented case we have is in the 13th century, right? And so we have a wave of migration that's personified by the Habshi elites, those from the Horn of Africa who achieved elite military and political status in India, especially in the Deccan, in the 17th century primarily. Then we have waves of migration that were due to the Mozambique export trade, which peaked in the 17th century. Then we had waves of migration that also involved, some were forced and some were free. So for example, some Eastern Africans who had arrived in Bombay, which is on the west coast of India, from Zanzibar, settled in Bombay and eventually migrated further inland into Hyderabad. Or there were Arab slave traders who were bringing Africans from Yemen to the city of Hyderabad in central southern India in the 1840s. So we have some forced migration, we have some free migration. But another interesting strand I'd also like to point out in discussing the provenance of the contemporary Siddhi communities of India are independent migrations that had nothing to do with labor. So we have two cases that I'll touch on very briefly. The cases of the paternal grandfathers of these two women who are aunt and niece. And the woman in the center, Rumana Ben Siddhi, she was a revered elder of the Siddhi community of Ahmedabad, the city of Ahmedabad in the state of Gujarat. And she recently passed away in April. But she was very instrumental in reviving the practice of playing the Malunga amongst Siddhis of Gujarat, and in reviving their devotional song tradition, which I'll touch on as we continue in our discussion today. But her paternal grandfather, Abdullah Bhai, it is understood that he traveled from Africa to Gujarat. The reasons for his journey were not stated. He married a Siddhi woman in Gujarat, a woman of African ancestry who was already living there. He had 2 sons and 1 daughter, and eventually he decided that he no longer wanted to stay in India. So he left of his own free will, and his wife had 7 brothers and did not feel any desire to leave India. So his wife and children stayed behind, and he is believed to have gone back to Zanzibar in particular, and he was never heard from again. So that's the paternal grandfather of the woman shown in the center of this image. The woman on the right, Zebunisa Ben, her paternal grandfather is remembered as having come from either Ethiopia or Sudan in sometime in the 20th century to India, fleeing a disease outbreak in his village, and the name of his village is remembered as Jumma. So these are two instances of what I have termed independent migrations, individuals perhaps traveling alone, perhaps traveling with smaller groups of people who came to India of their own accord, and some of them, such as Manaben's grandfather, actually returning to Africa of their own accord as well. So outside of the context of forced migrations and labor migrations. So in brief, this summer, I'm just sharing with you a summary of the presence of Afro-Descendants in India today. So by the turn of the 21st century, we find approximately 35,000 Indians who self-identify as Siddhis, or Indians of African ancestry. And large communities of Siddhis reside in the western Indian states of Gujarat and Karnataka. And there's also a community of African ancestry that calls themselves who call themselves Chaush, and they live in the city of Hyderabad, in what was formerly Andhra Pradesh, but now the state is Hyderabad is located in Telangana. So what I'd like to share with you today, the crux of my presentation today will be about the devotional songs of Siddhis in Gujarat, particularly in the city of Ahmedabad, and the language of these songs. So they are believed to be 125 canonical songs, which Siddhis, the Siddhi community of Gujarat preserves. And this archive also involves accompaniment to instrumental music, as we've seen with the centrally placed bow and the Mai Misra rattle. And this accompaniment of instrumental music with the devotional songs in the context of a performance that is called Goma or Dhamal is essentially the preservation of practices, Eastern African practices of Ngoma and Ngoma consciousness. However, what we find in the Indian context is that in diaspora, much of these practices have become attuned to the multi-religious and multivalent cultural landscape of Western India. And we find the same with those Swahili word items or lexical items that are found in some of these devotional songs, and that some of the elders are able to produce and attest from memory. So we have some prior studies of the preservation of Swahili lexical items in amongst the Siddhis of coastal Sindh, which is in present-day Pakistan, and Kutch, which is in Gujarat in present-day India. So the first study of this was conducted in 1851 by Richard Burton. He found 122 entries that are Swahili words, but also are words from other ethno-linguistic groups along the Swahili coast. Then we find in 2007, Abdulaziz Lodi, the linguist, Dr. Lodi identifies only 12 words and 12 phrases in use amongst Siddhis in 2 locations in Gujarat. In the time of my research in 2019, I've heard different people refer to this idea of Siddhi language or Siddhi Bhasha, which is a combination of Hindi, which is the national language of India, Gujarati, which is the state language of Gujarat, and some Swahili words and phrases. So when I interviewed the elder who shown in the center of the picture I've shown a few slides ago, Rumana Ben Siddhi, we find that she is able to recall 14 words, 14 Swahili words that were in use amongst her elders, remembering that her her grandfather, her paternal grandfather, had come from Zanzibar and returned to Zanzibar. So she remembered 14 words, including one verb, and also one sentence, right? And what I'd like to point out here are the Hindi inflections of these words, Swahili words that she's able to remember. Although, and just I'd like to point out here before, for clarity, Siddhis speak Hindi and Gujarati, and some of the elders may include some of these Swahili words in their language. However, and some of the young generation might include a word or two, like there was this word gema, which was used as the equivalent of the Hindi acha, meaning good. So one could say, you know, your hair looks gema. Is this bathroom gema? Is it clean? So this word gema was in use in quote Siddhi language, unquote. But the point here is that for all intents and purposes in day-to-day communication, Siddhis speak Hindi and Gujarati in the state of Gujarat. However, if you interview the elders or if you specifically ask for some words in quote Siddhi language, some of these words might be shared. So now I'd like to turn to the Hindi inflections of these words. There's the Swahili word watoto for children. The Siddhi attestation of this word is watoto for boy and watoti for girl. And if you're listening to my pronunciation, you might be able to hear that I've pronounced the T's with as retroflex sounds, which is something that happens with the pronunciation of foreign words in Hindi. The T's will become, the dental sounds will become manifested as retroflex sounds. So where you have watoto in Swahili, a Siddhi will attest this term as watoto or watoti for boy or girl. And what's missing in the Siddhi attestation is the understanding that the wa prefix is a pluralizer. And instead, the words are inflected according to Hindi grammatical rules for gender. So in Hindi, you have ladka, ladki for boy and girl, a being masculine ending, e being feminine ending. So those masculine and feminine gender markers are grafted onto the Swahili word for children, which within the Siddhi attestation then becomes the word for boy and girl. So likewise, with the Swahili word nguo for clothes, the Siddhi attestation of that would be unga, unge, following the Hindi pluralization, rules for pluralization, where masculine singular a ending turns into the masculine plural a ending. So nguo in Swahili amongst the Siddhi would be attested as unga or unge, for masculine singular and masculine plural. So just as we find these Hindi inflections of Swahili words that elders might be able to remember, you also find that the Ngoma consciousness, which Mr. Koala has elaborated for us, being adapted to the landscape of the diaspora. And I'll touch on that a bit more as I close the presentation. I'd just like to point out before closing some other ethno-linguistic evidence of Southeastern African heritage amongst the Siddhis. So Dr. Alpers, historian Ned Alpers, tells us that amongst the clan names for Siddhi, we find certain clan names that harken back to ethno-linguistic groups of Mozambique, Tanzania, Zanzibar. And these clan names include Makua, Murima, and Miava. Miava being a Hindiized form of the Wayao group. Then amongst the devotional songs of the Siddhis, the Jikr, from the Arabic word dhikr or remembrance of God, amongst the 125 canonical devotional songs of the Siddhis sung in honor of the Siddhi ancestor saints, we have certain phrases that preserve Swahili or words from other Bantu languages. So we have the song Zanzibari Hapa Gema, Maskati Hapa Gema. The Zanzibaris and Muscatis here are fine, are good, are happy. Then we have a few other songs that I'd just like to point out, select lyrics from. So in these songs from the Ahmedabad repertoire, we have lyrics that are pointing to displacement, that are pointing to kinlessness. So there is one song, Sine Mama Sine Dugu, Sine Mama Sine Dugu, Sine Mama Ya Malungu, where the speaker, Salmini Miskini, poor Salmini, is lamenting, Sina Mama, Sina Ndugu. I have no mother, I have no relatives, brother, oh God. In another devotional song, we have a female speaker who is lamenting that she does not have any children in her home. And the lyric, the phrase here is, Sina watoto mbani. Sina watoto mbani, madad gorishaki mbani. Tera labelia, tera kudabelia, Sina watoto mbani. So this female speaker is lamenting that she has no children in the home, and she says, God, my help. And then we have a third song, Makua lele makua, oh makua lele makua, dom gori bacha makua lele, ashra alaka makua lele makua. So this song is inviting the person of Makua ancestry, the Makua in India, in diaspora, to take the help of God. And many of the verses of these songs also invite the listener to take the help of God through the saints, the Siddhi ancestor saints, being Gorisha or Baba Gaur. And the last point I'd like to say here is that we have verses, these Swahili verses, right, speak to the alienation, speak to the kinlessness of someone in diaspora. Whereas when we get to the Hindi and songs of the 125 canonical songs, we find a response to this experience of kinlessness, of alienation, of having no children. For example, this Gujarati song is expressing that those who are in need can come to the shrine of my Misra. So the barren woman can come to my Misra shrine, and after coming there and propitiating this ancestor saint for blessings, you'll find that she's swinging a cradle in her home, so she will be blessed with children. So all of this points to, and I'm going to briefly conclude here, the way in which the Siddhi community of Gujarat, according to the theorizations of Dr. Helen Basu, established itself around the veneration of 3 central ancestor saints. So these are African Sufi saints, which according to my research arrived in Gujarat in the 14th century, in the 1300s. They arrived in Gujarat and they are buried today in the district of Bharuch, in a village called Ratan. And this is a picture of the shrine where they are buried as shown from afar. This is the entrance to the shrine. It is called a Dargah, a Sufi shrine in India. And here is the tomb of Baba Gaur, his sister Mai Misra on the right, and his brother Baba Habash on the left. These 3 saints, their names tell us, give us a hint into their origins. Baba Gaur, or Sidi Mubarak Nobi, arriving from Nubia, which is present-day Sudan. Baba Habash arriving from Ethiopia, Abyssinia. Mai Misra arriving from Egypt. So these 3 African Sufi saints who were buried in Gujarat by the late 14th century become the central focus for building community amongst Africans who are dispersed in Gujarat in the 19th and 20th century. And just as Swahili becomes influenced by Hindi and Gujarati, and just as we similarly find that Ngoma consciousness becomes indigenized, it becomes rooted or acculturated to the local iterations of religious expression. So we have a Sufi saint being venerated as an ancestor by Africans who are newly arrived in India and who establish community around the tombs of these Sufi saints. And on top of being venerated as an ancestor, my Misra is also venerated in terms of a Hindu goddess. And so just to exemplify that, I've shown two side-by-side images. On the left, we see an anthropomorphic construction of my Misra made from vessels filled with a sanctified substance. And on the right, we see a similar type of construction, which is created by Hindus in order to venerate various goddesses. So I'll end on that note, just to reinforce this idea of we have Ngoma consciousness in diaspora in Gujarat amongst Indians of African ancestry, yet the ritual apparatus becomes acculturated to the norms of religious practice in contemporary. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Graves. So much to say, but I will move immediately to Dr. Amira Nimji's presentation, which is going to be pre-recorded. And so I think Stacy will help us out with navigating that logistically. And so she focuses on Indo-African migration through a language game. So Stacy, are you there? Oh, here we go.
As far as I can remember, I have been attached to a continuing story of Indian Ocean migration. My parents, born and raised in Kenya and South Africa, immigrated to Canada in 1975, around the time that many other Ismaili Muslims began to enter the country from parts of Uganda and Tanzania. With the exception of my Punjabi, post-partition Pakistani grandmother, even my grandparents were raised in East and South Africa, and it was my great-grandparents who were the Indian emigres. The story was told often that they left Gujarat, leaving famine and unrest for mercantile opportunities in Africa, living in what was largely racially segregated East and apartheid South Africa for a couple generations, and subsisting in Ismaili colonies. Here they continued to speak Kutchi and Gujarati, in addition to Swahili and the enforced Afrikaans. They attended Jamaat Khana, observing the religious holidays that mark the Muslim and Sufi calendar, as well as the birthday and leadership of the transnational community's spiritual leader, His Highness the Aga Khan. Growing up in a suburb of Toronto, which today hosts a population of over 50,000 Ismaili Muslims, whose ethnic origins lie in South Asia, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Iran, and increasingly Syria, my life has always been organized around the Ismaili community, and particularly Khojas. Though a term denoting our caste, I was always told growing up that Khoja referred to Gujarati-speaking Ismailis who migrated from India to East and South Africa particularly. This is a rather incomplete picture of South Asian mercantile communities of Khoja Ismailis and Ishnasheris or Twelvers, as well as Parsis and caste communities of Vanyas or Banyanis and Chetiars. I refer to Pedro Machado's book, Ocean of Trade, which illustrates some of the caste and ethno-linguistic complexities of South Asian merchants in the Indian Ocean. In Toronto, I saw the history of our Indian Ocean migration reflected in my rather compartmentalized Ismaili upbringing. Outside this community, though, my Desi life was very different than what quickly became dominant in my hometown of Brampton, as Indians from the subcontinent migrated through the 1980s and 1990s. My parents were beneficiaries of Canada's resettlement of Ugandan Asian refugees in the country, which was very different than the post-1965 Immigration and Nationality Act in the United States, which saw South Asian migration and citizenship allotment in America. And I refer to the work of Shehzad Mohammadi, and particularly his doctoral dissertation, Gifts from Amin, to tease the specificity of the Indo-African migration to Canada. In this paper, I evaluate the complex ways in which Khoja Ismailis of this migrational history perform connections, both real and imagined, with the Indian Ocean. Having titled this paper Performing Memory, I theorize memory as a space of both ethnographic and performative potential, wherein history, community, lived experience, longing, imagination, and story commingle. Scholar Paul Stoller writes in an article on ethnography that, above all, anthropologists tell other people's stories. On the role of imagination in them, he writes, "The imagination enables us to tell stories, which give birth to new stories, which generate, in turn, more stories. In the end, the imagination always brings us back to the story." Focusing away from the telling of stories, I continue this presentation by showing two case studies of how Ismailis have continued to perform stories of the Indian Ocean and of their place in it. I take my methodological cue from the discipline of performance studies to bring together a photograph and online game as three examples of, in Richard Schechner's words, performances as actions. I pull from material objects and lived experiences from my own extended family, in which I draw meaning and story from what have circulated as memories of the Indian Ocean for several generations. So the first case study, a photograph. I begin with this photograph, which has been in our family for 4 generations and now resides in the South Asian collection at the Royal Ontario Museum. The photograph is dated approximately to 1910 and features my great-grandfather, Babaji, or my big Babaji, and great-grandmother, whom my mum called Ma. They traveled from India to settle in Eldoret, Kenya, probably in the first decade of the 1900s. The photo is quite large in size and was taken at the studio of Shahpurji Hormusji, one of Bombay's then most prominent studios on the famed Galbadevi Road. It is what is referred to as a painted photograph, wherein paint was applied to either the photographic negative or developed photo itself to embellish features and certain desires that were offered of the portrait studio as a stage. And you can see some of the paint, especially in the border to Ma's Bacheri, also called dupatta in Urdu and Hindi. While the photo itself is fascinating in its composition and production, my interest today lies in actions around the object in my family as performances of memory. I remember this photograph hanging in the bedroom of my grandparents in their Toronto home. Following the death of my grandfather and my grandmother's move to our home, the photo remained in its frame, but not hung in our basement. It was both an everyday and sensational object, moving between Bombay and Eldoret, Eldoret and Nairobi and Toronto. In the summer of 2020, Royal Ontario Museum curator Dipali Devan conducted an interview with my mother and me on the topic of the photo. In response to Dipali's question about the photograph's sitters, my mother pulled from disparate and connected memories of being told about her Babaji, seated here and named Ali Bai Nur Muhammad, who died when her father, my grandfather, was 6 years old. She remembers Ma through standing here in the photo as Motibai Alibai Nur Muhammad, seldom left the bed in a prominent area of their Eldoret brick house, home to the joint family that included my grandfather's siblings, their wives, and children. She was never in parda, but often wore a pacheri dress, covering her head as she does in this photo, which my mother remembers of many women in Eldoret in Nairobi. My mother spoke vividly of Pabi, who was the widow of my grandfather's older brother, who seldom spoke, but cooked constantly over a sagari, a coal-burning stove, while my grandfather ran the family's general store, Alibai and Sons, in Eldoret. Their life was at once Indian and East African, reflected in their foodways, dress, languages, and rites of passage. Following a rather stream of consciousness retelling of these stories, Dipali asked the question in our interview, did Babaji and Ma ever return to India? My mother responded, not that I know of, because when they emigrated to Kenya, to Africa, they didn't look back. They started a new life in Africa, and the idea was to get their siblings and families over, because when they did well, they of course were there to share their wealth with the family at home in India, and essentially their wealth was their business in Kenya. And they wanted their cousins and uncles and part of the clan in India to come and join them in their wealth. For my mother and for many members of my family and the Ismaili community, the Indian Ocean represented a one-way portal for migration wherein emigres left and didn't look back. Dipali's research on the photograph, however, tells a different story. Given the age of the photo, its sitters, my great-grandparents, these two sitters here, and the story of their marriage in comparison to others in their generation, it is likely that the photograph was a marriage portrait taken at the port of Bombay upon a return trip to India to retrieve my great-grandfather's bride and return by ship to Kenya. As opposed to the oft-told they didn't look back, the Indian Ocean was a two-way channel, a passageway for connecting India with their lives, foodways, kin connections, and sociocultural and religious practices in East Africa, which my mother memorializes in her reflections on the photograph. Here, the Indian Ocean connected here and there, with changing vantage points depending on whether here meant East Africa or India. And this here-there-ness remains actively performed in and of the photograph. So I'll move on to the second case study, a virtual game. I bring about another case study in performing memory of the Indian Ocean in the design and release of a virtual game at the end of last year. Titled Bolivia, meaning forget it or forgot it in Kachi, the game is similar to the boxed party game Taboo, for those of you who know, but is designed for gameplay on Zoom. And I'll just show you how this kind of works here. The game is freely available through a link on Google Drive, which contains a folder of instructions and materials for play. And you can log into the Google Drive link using this link here, and then it opens a very, very simple interface of Google Drive, as I'm sure you're all familiar, with some instructions that are designed. And then a series of words, and I'll explain how they work. It is the object of the game to have a rotating clue giver receive these words in a private Zoom chat with the host or President Saib of the game, and this draws on an in-joke commentary on the bureaucratic organization of the Ismaili community. So basically, if you take the word Ginigin, for example, which means take it in Kachi, the clue giver is sent this word by the President Saib on Zoom in a private chat or a direct message, and it is their objective to have their team on Zoom guess the word Ginigin without reciting or saying any of these what are called haram words, either in Kachi or in English. The words themselves derive from not just Kutchi, but Gujarati, Hindi, Urdu, Swahili, and Sindhi, reflecting the Khichdi or mixture of languages that is contained within a larger Kutchi framework. And though there's a bit of a legend here for identifying some of the origin languages, it's really a big, big mix. The words reference also Ismaili rites of passage, kin relationships, and ceremonies that take place in Jamaat Khana, and these include things like Niyaz, Khum, and Randan Committee, many of which likely refer to Persian and Arabic words that relate to the community's larger Muslim theological practice. And perhaps you can spot some here. Randan Committee is here. Another one, Biali, which is a little cup that we use to drink holy water, etc. Created by Toronto and New York-based Adil Dalla and Shazia Abji, respectively, Bolivia sought to connect Ismaili families, especially during the winter holidays of 2020, as the pandemic wore on and families could not be together in person. In an interview with Shazia just a few days ago, she elaborated on some loftier goals for the game. She explained that she sought to use the game as a way to connect with Kutchi as a language that she used to be able to speak, and demonstrates the specificity of the Indo-African migration story in Canada. She noted that Bolivia was a way for her to relearn Kutchi, not just by selecting and re-relating to particular vocabulary, but in choosing the haram or taboo words, she was forced to understand linguistic context. She elaborated, the process of making the game allowed us to connect with our parents, aunts, and uncles, and asking them what these mean, which led to much more discussion and insight, and language is such a portal into culture, into the norms and values. It recalibrated the power structure of families. So playing this game was amazing because all of my cousins and nieces and nephews were the worst players, and all of the adults were super fluent and they were the strongest players. Especially in a virtual setting where often the younger folks who are so much more tech fluent, it was a nice moment to have the elders in the family feel like this was their thing. According to a 2014 study by the Center for Applied Linguistics, there are less than 1 million Kutchi speakers in the world today, with most concentrated in East Africa. The endangered place of the language is reflected in Shazia's reflections, wherein a pseudo-facility with the language represents a loss of connection to the specificity of her Indian and African heritage. Attempts to preserve and quite literally keep Kutchi in play in the game of Bolivia performs a connection to and of the Indian Ocean as a language that was formed from the establishment of Kutchi speakers in parts of East Africa. Kutchi itself draws reference from this Indian Ocean migration, while the game performs memory of this as the language, praxis, and culture at large could otherwise be lost. I bring together the two case studies of the photograph and Bolivia to show how they share connections in performing memory of the Indian Ocean. These memories are in part lore, story, imagination, and history. Most importantly, the performative actions of recalling and reflecting demonstrate how a 3 generations ago migration is brought into the present and is actually actively the present. I plan for these 2 case studies to join a few others, in particular wedding songs and recipes or foodways that do similar work in the active performance of Indian Ocean memory. And I'll just share one that I didn't have time to make it into the presentation, which is a recipe for bharazi, which is kind of I guess a curry or like a stew that one eats with what is called mandazi, which is kind of like a donut. an East African donut. And this recipe showed up on the food blog called Serious Eats a couple months ago. And the article that I show here is kind of doing the work that I mentioned in my paper here, which is the active reflection on the performance of memory. So with that, I will end. I look forward to our discussion, and I thank you very, very much for listening.
Okay, wonderful. So before we begin Q&A, I just want to say that I anticipate us going slightly over time. We were originally slated to end at 12:15, but we patiently waited for the prior panel to end. So I don't want to take time away from our wonderful presenters in terms of having them field questions and help clarify certain inquiries that we may have. So I'm going to invite Brother Coella as well as Dr. Graves back. And so I guess as moderator, I'll take the initiative to point out some things that I see happening in some of these presentations. So one of the things that I noted in Brother Coella's presentation is that the bows that were used in these performances in the film that you have, Sages and Bows, I noted similar bows used in capoeira, right? Capoeira is a quite old sort of form of African sort of martial arts, but also, yeah, resistance and yeah, I'll just leave it there. Martial arts seen in Brazil and Angola. And for me, the presence of the bow highlights seen in your film as represented and present in Mozambique, Southern Africa, as well as in India, highlights and illustrates the manner in which these sort of musical traditions, grammars, sounds, technologies of spiritual and artistic expression all travel around the diaspora, right, in some very interesting ways. That seems to resonate quite forcefully with Jasmine's presentation. And it actually serves, I think, as a reminder, all of your work, that Africa is much bigger than the continent, right? This is something that I tell my students all the time. And so insofar as I understand capoeira as a technology of protection and resistance, I was wondering if you could sort of highlight for us some of the ways in which this, or revisit for us some of the ways in which this shows up in Ngoma consciousness, particularly through the sort of its musical formations. And then another question that I had was, what about the body, right? What about the body? And what about the audience? Because in the film, we have a lens focused intently on the these masteries, or I'm thinking masters, and their performance. But I'm wondering how the rhythms that they produce determine or catalyze movement, right, in a kind of way. And I'm thinking beyond just the body itself, but movement in terms of like a kind of, in a sense of like organized location and relocation, migrations of peoples, as well as the presence of dance, right? I'm wondering if that is relevant for, in your case, and if so, how, right? So these are things that are sort of swirling around in my head. I was wondering if we might have an opportunity to hear from you on those things. And of course, as other questions come up, please feel free to jump in, our audience members.
Thanks so much for those two questions. Yeah, I'll start with the consciousness of capoeira. And I'll give a personal anecdote of it. You know, it's beautiful to understand capoeira because you see how globalized the bow has become due to capoeira. You know, I'll move around with different bows. And someone always be like, is that the birimbao? Is that the birimbao? You know,
Yeah.
just notice within capoeira being the birimbao. One of my teachers and masters, Babu Sazi Dlamini, you know, also had a bow master in his own right, said, it's interesting when you understand the functions of bows. And if you look at capoeira, you understand, you see a resistance bow. If you look at the malunga, and just very shallow translations or interpretations of it, you see a bow that is so devotional and so connected to spirit. You see another bow, for example, umakweyan, that's connected so much to, as you said, ukugida, or dance forms, movement forms. The one played by Umamu Bavigilengema. So it's, the bow has become so performative, which is happens a lot in Southern Africa. The bow becomes performative, and by virtue of the bow becoming performative, the cultural consciousness and intellectual integrity becomes only viewed through the lens of performativity. And for me, that is not necessarily bad, but I think it reduces what I'm trying to propagate, which is the ngoma consciousness. So for example, within capoeira, because it retains within it, and if you think about ngoma, if you think about ngoma or African traditional or cultural consciousness that connect to religion, movement, prayer, ancestral, divination, etc. You see the circle within capoeira, you see the roda, which is a circle. You see clapping, it's very powerful vibration that's found within Asia, which is found also within capoeira and in Southern Africa and much of the larger African context. You see the drum or percussive instruments. You see chants, a lot of chanting. And so for me, what I find so powerful about this connection of ngoma consciousness, as you said, it shows that, and I said this in a previous presentation on ngoma consciousness, what my interest was is that, wow, here are people, here are communities within the whole of the world who are connected to Africa. And you'll find that so often within the diaspora, people are longing for Africa. But within Africa, not many people know about the communities within the other African communities. And so, for example, within my experience in Brazil with capoeira, their form of integrating the consciousness of movement, sound, religion into a holistic practice, not forget about globalizing it, and keeping its cultural, historical integrity through understanding that these were enslaved people resisting, forming quilombos or free societies within the jungle, connected to Africa, whether it be through Ife or the religion in Yoruba, or coming down to Angola. You see that I learned that, wow, in Southern Africa, for example, we so focus on the performative aspect and forgetting all of these other elements that make ngoma. And here in Capoeira and Brazil here are the African communities who are retaining that consciousness within a more holistic sense, as an example. Within India, structurally, when I was sitting making the instrument with Master Sultan, they used what you make the bow, the string is made from dart, which is the inner intestine of a cow. Just a bit complicated to get because of the cultural and religious complications with the cow within India. And I guess this is some of the interesting dynamics. But what I found is that when you hear old historical accounts, whether written by Kirby when he was collecting instruments in Southern Africa, you know that instruments were made with intestines or sinews, but today they're no longer made in that way. And what was powerful about that revelation is that, wow, other Africans within other communities within diaspora can teach us about ourselves as much as they want to learn from us. The consciousness is together as much as capoeira can teach us about how to venerate, how to move, how to draw in energy or share or umoya within the body and vibrate with the command of the bow, which leads me to your second concept of the relationship with the body. Man, the relationship with the body is so integral within Ngoma consciousness because it's, in some part, it's the primary mechanism or technology in which to vibrate the consciousness. So, for example, when I was just speaking up in the presentation, I spoke about umakhulu undo ubavigilengema umabhemu. when you look at her body, you see that the relationship with the vibrations of the bow are deeply connected to what she's feeling and transmitting. But in the same breath, that bow, because it's open, this is her in her home just playing for herself. But when you see her playing within larger communities, it's a lot of dancing. You know, the bow is played with traditional songs, which can be accompanied by drums and can be accompanied by movement. But my interest in the relationship of ngoma and the body is that, as I said, ngoma is translated as either dance, song, drum, but these are all in regions. But when you look at it holistically, you realize that the vibration or the ability to vibrate is a mechanism of vibration can either be translated into the vibration of a string musically, or the body vibrating itself in relation to that, or creating the vibration itself. And so within the bow itself, within the Siddhis, there's the beautiful presentation by Dr. Jasmine. It illustrates that in Siddhi Ngoma, massive amounts of dancing, massive amounts of movements while playing. Not so much when playing the seleni or the malunga, but when playing the percussive sounds or playing the mulgaman or the other drums, there's a lot of movement, and the Mai Mishra uses the rattle. I noticed though, when playing the seleni, there was always a stillness that happened. And I remembered asking, hey, what rhythm? So he was like, what's chila for? The rhythm that he was playing. He said, what we used to do is we used to hide things, and we used to play shila dun dun. And it was a process of divination. One would need to go and find what was hidden through channeling that sound. But similarly, when you understand, when they say, why the seleni was also understood as being able to stop izilo or ancestral animals like the lion. When walking around the wild and there was danger, you could play the seleni and stop wild animals. This consciousness is also within the Ngoma consciousness within Africa, the relationship with divination or spiritual technology of African peoples. And just to end that question off, I think and from that presentation of Dr. Graves really flood back a lot of memories to understand that the resilience and resistance of Ngoma. In Brazil, how the people retain Ngoma or aspects of Ngoma or African ancient traditions, and still can pass it on today. And within the cities as well, how the resilience of the ancestral coding said that we will travel across the sea and transmit this message of vibration, of instrumentation, not for you only to perform, but for you to remind yourself of yourself, for you to vibrate, to move, to venerate. And I think that's what's beautiful about the consciousness. You know, it's living within the unseen and seen will come out.
Yeah, the word, I mean, you know, thinking beyond the question of performance, the term discourse comes to mind. Indeed, yeah. So just before we move to the next question, I just want to remind people to take care of themselves as needed. Since we're going over time, this is officially the panel after party, I guess. So let's move to Brother Ojo. He has a question. Brother Ojo.
Yes, please. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I'm not bringing myself back in terms of video, but I could not help myself as the presentations were going, and kudos to the presenters. I think you really educated us in terms of connections between Africa and Asia. And it's one area that we all need to learn more, and I really appreciate the work. But the big elephant in the room, given all the presentations, is still the issue of the Europeans. And I really apologize that I have to bring it to the fore. Because when the first presenter was talking about Ngoma consciousness, I could not really get over the idea that he's giving us a perspective that is so deep, but given all our instructions, even in the field of African studies, Ngoma is in South Africa where the religious medical people, so it was more like the African juju in Southern Africa. And it can be reinterpreted, it can be expanded, but never really given the depth. So I want to ask this question for the first presentation. To what extent do we need to begin to redefine some of these issues? Not necessarily only emphasizing the connection with the diaspora, but also within the local setting, the African setting, in which our intellectuals continue to either debate European definitions or the attempt to justify or quote unquote prove European definitions. So in Ngoma consciousness, as you have discussed it, and you've used music and sound waves and all which is basically healing, which is also consciousness about your environment, the link with things you do and so on, is deeper than what we were taught in terms of when it comes to Ngoma in Southern Africa, even within the field of African studies. So that's my first question. Whereas your focus seems to be showing the connection with the diaspora, but I would like to implore that there might be a need to actually focus on the idea of Ngoma consciousness even before we talk about connections. Because I don't think locally we know it ourselves. And that is the Southern African aspect. There might be elements of it that one can talk about with West Africa. So maybe we need to stop always pre-emptying ourselves by first of all giving the European definition of what is not European. Because in your presentation, you also started with, even though it was a little bit dismissive, because you were a little bit defensive about it, it's been defined as just religious practice. No, that is not a dismissive thing. That is what is taught. We all learn. Once you say Ngoma, we quickly finish the conversation and say, oh, those are the religious abolishs or whatever we give them. So, but now, given your presentation, one sees that this is deeper than that. So that's the first one. My second question to Dr. Graves, and again, I'm dealing with European challenges. And I don't want to sound like, what is the best way to put it? I don't want to be defensive, but African expansion to the old world, African diaspora cannot be discussed with the pretense that slavery and violence is not core to it. Some places, migration and everything, we have many ways we've dispersed around the world. So my question is this: without Europeans, through the Atlantic slave trade, turning humans into chattels, removing their humanity, would we not be talking about African movement, both forced and voluntary, across the world, without necessarily feeling that we have to first of all apologize? Our Atlantic slave trade, the sea is a burial ground, whereas for Indian Ocean, the sea is not. I think Africans have done both. They've done forced and non-forced migration. Europeans have sold people, Africans have sold people, Arabs have sold people. But until Europeans, at least in the 17th century, began to think they are no longer people, the issue of migration would have really helped us to just discuss two types of migration. Some were forced, some were voluntary. So I want to ask you, to what extent are we going to sort of include that perversion that Europe has put in our history, recent Europeans, because old Europeans were selling themselves too, but recent Europeans have put in our history, and I'm talking 16th, 17th century, to the extent that when we look at the Siddhis, we don't continue I'm sorry, this is because I was really troubled. As you were giving their story, you kept trying to avoid the element of some Siddhis were sold, some were not sold. But this is the story of Africans everywhere. But why do we keep trying not to focus on the violence? Because some of them, even today, when you talk about Siddhis in India, except for experts like you and scholars like you and others who work on these small communities, Indians talk about non-existence of African heritage in India. It's very recent migration, which is not true. So I'm asking, how long do we encourage European perversion in our discussion of African diaspora? Is it important that we must always either avoid it or get around it? Because it takes away from all the good work that we are doing about our own connections. I'm not sure if I'm clear.
So can I ask that we allow Jasmine to respond, since we already heard from Brother Koala? That's fine? Okay.
I appreciate your question. I appreciate your passion, in decentering the perversions that inform the way we discuss African studies and African diaspora studies and the African diasporan experience. I'll answer that question on 3 different levels. On the first level, for me personally, as a descendant of Africans who were brought into chattel slavery in the Americas. It's a deeply emotional process to perpetually invoke the memory of violence. And so for the sake of my composure as a presenter, I don't always center the trauma. That's one thing. On another level, it's the history of the African diaspora in the Indian Ocean world is so radically different from the history of the African diaspora in the Atlantic, where Europeans were, particularly the Portuguese, forced their way onto the scene in the Indian Ocean world and essentially changed the dynamics of trade in the Indian Ocean world. However, Africans were always a minority among those who are enslaved in the Indian Ocean world. Slavery was never centered on Africans. And also, when we also consider the larger history, if we look at prior to the 13th century, which is when we have the first documented evidence of enslaved Africans in India, when we look prior to that, we understand that the free movement of Ethiopian traders and merchants was a large part of the ethos of the Indian Ocean world for millennia, right? So that's one thing. When we look at slavery in India, prior to the arrival of the Portuguese and their enslavement of Eastern Africans in places like Goa, when we look at the history of Africans who forcibly migrated to India, the trajectory of one's social integration into that space is radically different from what we saw in the Atlantic world. So in the Indian Ocean world, we have figures like Malik Umber, we have African elites who become military generals leading regiments of thousands of other Africans. We have these elites who go on to exercise great political authority and military might in India from, say, the 1500s to the 1600s. We have dynasties of African royal families governing certain princely states in India. And these royal families, that their descendants exist in up until today. So it's just a radically different history. However, we cannot, as I'm agreeing with you in that we cannot divorce our discussion of this history from the suffering of the ancestors who crossed the sea. So when we think about the way Siddhis relate to this history, the elder that I was speaking, that I shared the story of her paternal grandfather who arrived from Africa, she expressly states that he was not a slave. So she wants to emphasize that the fact that some of these migrations were not forced. And likewise, you'll see other Siddhis who emphasize the same thing, that perhaps in a way that's contrary to fact. Other Siddhis will say our ancestors have never been slaves, which is not the case, but it points to the way in which people in diaspora wrestle with this legacy of slavery and how it might impact their status in society today and their experience as marginalized people today. But and I'll just end with this, this idea of the Ngoma consciousness, right? In communicating the ancestral knowledge, spiritual healing, technologies of the ancestors, Ngoma becomes a space for the Siddhis of Gujarat. It's a space of healing. And given that you had Eastern Africans of diverse ethnicities, diverse backgrounds, maybe with having had difficulty communicating with one another, all of these individuals mostly forcibly dispersed into Gujarat in the 19th century. We find that these different individuals who are singing of kinlessness and their experience as dispersed and displaced peoples, they established a community around the veneration of African Sufi saints who were buried in Gujarat centuries prior to their arrival. So this process of community formation, establishing lineages of kinship with these saints and therefore with one another as brothers and sisters who are all children of these African patron saints who are protecting them in the space of Gujarat in diaspora, points to the way that Ngoma was used as a space, as a technology for healing the wounds inflicted by slavery.
Wonderful, wonderful. So let's go ahead and applaud our presenters for these wonderful opportunities for us to learn and grow. Thank you so much for the work that you do. And I, as well as I'm sure other people will be continue to reach out to you to connect and learn more. Thank you so much to our brother Coella, as well as Dr. Graves, for your wonderful work. Thank you.